Mozart wrote his compositions. He perfected them in his mind first and then wrote them down. And it must have been rather tedious and boring for a genius like him to sit down and write something that already was perfected. In the case of the piano concerti, you can see oftentimes the cadenzas must have been also a last-minute effort to please the publisher, because he would have written the piece, he would have performed it, and he typically would improvise the cadenzas. So when I performed with the Salzburg Chamber Soloists through the US and Mexico, I opted to write my own cadenza. And I wanted to actually do it the same way like in Mozart's times, which means I do not sit down and write something, but I improvise. In this case, I looked at the score and tried to find elements of the first movement that I found to be suitable. When you write a cadenza or you improvise a cadenza, you are not supposed to duplicate the composer's compositions or excerpts of it, but rather present the material in a new light, maybe presenting a theme in a totally different tonality, or changing something, or embellishing something, or combining themes and materials, so that whatever you hear in a cadenza is something new that you never heard in the surrounding movement. And it might also, besides highlighting the virtuosity of the performer, also gives light into, or sheds light to the intellectual possibilities of that soloist. And of course, in order to get there, you have to practice that. The art of improvisation today is lost to us as classical musicians, because this is not something we are typically trained to do or motivated towards doing. And I personally believe that if you're able to improvise something on the spot and you practice that and you maybe then imitate a composer, you ultimately will perform the given piece of the composer better, because you found through your own playing and fooling around with something that sounds like Mozart or might sound like Chopin, you discover the language of the composer and therefore play the given piece so much better. So let's talk about some of the elements that are used in the Mozart cadenza. So here is the first theme for the pianist. Very beautiful theme, a little bit dominated by trills and by the dotted rhythm, but it stays only in C major and the dominant, so it is probably not so suitable for a cadenza writing. So I opted not to use that. The second theme was much more appealing to me. I thought with its melodious singing tone, I could use that very much as a contrast to virtuosic elements in the cadenza. Speaking of virtuosic elements, let's see what there is. We have this. Sparkling and a little bit interesting because of the two voices. And then the left hand. So I could probably use that. Very similar is, of course, this. It's the same thing in reverse, exchanging hands. So maybe I can use that. How about this here? That definitely lends itself very well to write a cadenza. What fascinated me really was this idea. This is an element that is probably a very good beginning. And there is also the very typical long chain of events, actually not events, but scales. The scales and the famous trill that signals to the conductor, okay, this is the end of the cadenza. So definitely I'm going to use this. So my cadenza starts with the, what I would call the closing motive or theme. And so on. When you play a cadenza, and whether it's your own cadenza or whether it is written out, one of the things that I think especially music students have to observe, that is, it should not sound that it is rehearsed. So even though now I know my cadenza and I even have it written down, it should remain in the style of an improvisation, and that means you cannot keep the tempo steady. You cannot play it as if you know exactly what's coming up. So you have to somehow give the illusion, yes, you make it up on the spot. And that means you take certain liberties, you take sometimes a little bit time, you might change the tempo a little bit, and definitely the sound, to make it all very new and very fresh for the listener.